When I look at the world, I see people of all colours, but struggle to know who I can or should identify with. I have been described as Gujarati, Lebanese, Macedonian, Navajo, Roma, the list goes on. Though I live in Canada and was born and raised English, some people decide I'm from elsewhere. I feel like I'm wearing a disguise that I can't remove at will. Where are you really from? Yes, but where are your parents from? I am a musician, a mother, grandmother, an artist, a writer. I am comfortable being who I am. But I have a disconnect between me and the colour of my skin. Looking in the mirror, even now I am surprised at what I see. My skin is brown. I'm a person of colour, a POC. Du Bois, the African-American philosopher, describes it thus: a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. When the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements emerged across the Western world, they rattled the status quo of the society that many of us live in. I became aware then, more than any other time in my life, of the question, how do people see me? This story is about my English mother, a visual artist with a long career as a painter and textile artist. She's biracial. She would say brown, the world would say black. It's complicated. She was born and raised amongst the rolling hills of working-class Taunton, Somerset, famous for cheddar cheese, basketry and alcoholic cider. My mum lived with her mother, Sylvia, 3 brothers, an aunt, 2 cousins and her grandparents, Gran and Grandpa Harris, all 10 of them in a 3-bedroomed 1920s council house. Think Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Gran Harris ruled the roost with her strength and her sewing machine, clothing many wealthy clients and her large family. My grandfather, Calvin, was a visual artist. He arrived in Taunton from Maryland, USA as a 33-year-old G.I. with the 372nd Coloured Infantry. Calvin and Sylvia met at a dance during the blackout. They argued fiercely, but a spark was lit. Calvin had fallen in love far away from his American wife. Sylvia was in a loveless marriage with a largely absent and abusive husband, and she, too, fell in love. He surprised her by visiting her at home. She was so shocked that she stood up, throwing her book into the fire. It was a passionate but fragmented relationship. Sylvia already had a toddler and Calvin was being treated for TB. When the war ended, the GIs were forced to leave their loves and their babies behind, including Calvin and Sylvia's baby, Susan Anna, who looked just like her father. Calvin wanted to adopt and take her back to the USA. He couldn't. An unwritten understanding between the British and US governments forbid the adoption of mixed-race children. Even if they could have married, US and British law stated no Negro soldier will be given permission to marry any British white girl. Young Susan had light brown skin and loose curly hair. Her grandmother, trying to protect her, said it was a throwback to a Spanish sailor from the Armada. My mum knew the story was a fabrication, but learned it would stop people asking awkward questions. The procreation of half-caste children was considered a difficult social problem. So after the war, many so-called brown babies were scooped up and placed in children's homes to be adopted by wealthy white families, only too happy to take in a little black girl, tying a white ribbon in her untamable hair. Toddler Susan Anna was placed in a children's home for an altogether different reason. Sylvia's largely absent husband came home, probably drunk again, found his wife with a black bastard toddler and beat her to within an inch of her life. She was in hospital for months. Susan ended up in a home, the only black child, half-caste written on her index card. Back in the USA, Calvin admitted his affair to his wife, and extraordinarily, they sent money regularly to my grandmother for his English daughter's upkeep. Calvin promised Sylvia that on their daughter's 16th birthday, he would return to England and meet them on the steps of the National Gallery in London. They never met. Well before then, she told her daughter that Calvin had died, when in fact he was very much alive. Mum shared a bed with her 3 brothers till she was 8, then her mother's bed till she left home at 17 and moved to London, where the cultural explosion of the 1960s was in full flow. She saw other women who looked like her, and for the first time, she wasn't an outsider. It was only then that she felt comfortable saying her father was African-American. Her mother, Sylvia, died from Alzheimer's before all the questions were asked, leaving us with few answers. Growing up, I noticed that family secrets were weighing heavily on my mum's mental health. As part of her healing journey, knowing her father's name was on her birth certificate, she applied to the US government for his records. Days before my first child was born, a thick manila envelope arrived containing Calvin's entire life on paper. This paperwork was life-changing. Calvin died on July the 8th, 1965, just 4 months after the historical march from Selma to Montgomery, and 4 years after Susan's 16th birthday. 2 weeks before Mum's 60th birthday, we found ourselves in Boston, Massachusetts, knocking on Calvin's door. He wasn't there, of course, but to our surprise, the owner directed us to Calvin's adopted son, who lived just around the corner. Incredibly, we soon bonded over blood ties, photos and familiar family resemblances. We were gifted Calvin's art portfolio, and we learnt of Calvin's life after the war as a sign writer struggling with TB. Calvin was emerging as a caring father, with a dog named Zeus, a dapper dresser who loved his hats, a documented grandson of an enslaved family, a sensitive human who wrote, "When I see something beautiful, it does something to me inwardly." As I laid flowers on my grandfather's grave, I felt a tangible shift of self and identity. There's something really settling about knowing your roots, knowing how you fit into the world, and watching intergenerational wounds heal. Who am I? I am enough. I am enough.